The year is 1626, and you are born into exile. Not the dramatic kind, not fire and swords. The quiet, grinding, generational kind, where your people have been wandering for 1500 years, waiting for a promise that never arrives. You are born in Smyrna, a port city on the western edge of the Ottoman Empire, where the sea smells like salt and old ambition and fish that have been dead 3 days too long. Your father is a middling merchant, your mother dies young, and from the very beginning there is something wrong with you. Not wrong in a bad way. Wrong in the way all prophets are wrong. The way you stare too long at candle flames. The way you wake up at 3 in the morning and can't explain why your chest feels full of something too large for a human body to hold. You are different. The rabbis notice. You are brilliant. The rabbis are impressed. You memorize the Talmud before most boys your age can grow a proper beard. You fall into the mystical depths of the Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, sacred geometry, the secret architecture of God, with an intensity that makes your teachers shift uncomfortably in their chairs. You are 6 years old and you are already becoming something dangerous. Here's what you inherit. A people ground down to powder by history. Jews in the 17th century Ottoman Empire are not slaves technically. They're protected. They pay their taxes. They live in their quarters. They practice their faith, but they carry something heavier than chains. They carry expectation, the waiting, the ancient, exhausting, generational waiting for the Messiah, the anointed one, who will end the exile, return the scattered tribes to the Holy Land, and make the suffering mean something. Every generation, a rabbi somewhere announces that the Messiah is coming. Every generation, people pack their bags, sell their furniture, and wait. Every generation, nothing happens, and the disappointment settles into the bones like cold water finding every crack. You grow up soaked in that disappointment, and you decide, consciously or not, even you will never be entirely sure that you are the answer to it. You are 22 years old and you do something that should end your career before it starts. In the synagogue of Smyrna, surrounded by elders and scholars and men who have spent their entire lives studying the precise, correct way to avoid pronouncing the full name of God, you pronounce it out loud. The 4 sacred letters said aloud, which Jewish law strictly forbids. The room goes still the way rooms go still before earthquakes. Every jaw drops. Every spine straightens. You smile. Not a nervous smile. Not an apologetic smile. A satisfied one. And then you announce, calmly, clearly, as if reading from a weather report, that you are the Messiah, the anointed one, the one they've been waiting for, that the redemption of the world will flow through your hands and they are welcome to come along. Now, let's talk about something important. Are you lying? This is where the history gets genuinely disturbing and where it separates from the simple con man story you were probably expecting. Modern scholars who have studied your life believe you suffer from what we would today call bipolar disorder. You move in hard cycles, weeks of crushing, suicidal darkness, periods where you can barely get out of bed, where the silence in your skull feels like a physical weight, followed by explosive volcanic periods of divine illumination, where you feel connected to everything at once, where the universe seems to be speaking directly through your vocal cords. During those highs, you don't experience yourself as a con man. You experience yourself as chosen, selected, lit from the inside. This is not a comfort. This is worse, because it means the most impactful false prophet in Jewish history was, on some level, a genuine believer. You're not manipulating people from a safe distance of cynical calculation. You're drowning right alongside them, just in different water. The rabbis of Smyrna do the only reasonable thing. They excommunicate you. You're out, banned, spiritually expelled from your own hometown at age 22 for claiming to be God's chosen representative on earth. In a normal story, this is where it ends. You become a cautionary tale, someone's obscure footnote, the weird guy who had to leave Smyrna, but you're not normal, and this is not that story. For the next 10 years, you wander. Jerusalem, Cairo, Thessaloniki, Constantinople. You move through the Jewish communities of the Ottoman Mediterranean like a spiritual storm system, arriving in cities, making proclamations that split rooms down the middle, gathering a handful of ecstatic believers, enraging the established rabbinical authorities, getting pushed out, and moving on. In every city, the same pattern, the same drama. A few people lean in, most dismiss you. The local rabbis issue a statement, you leave. But here's what the wandering actually teaches you. People. You watch which communities are the most desperate. You notice which rabbis are threatened versus genuinely curious. You learn which arguments land and which fall flat. You learn intuitively, viscerally, because you are brilliant, that people don't follow prophets because the theology is airtight. They follow prophets because the prophet makes them feel like their pain finally makes sense. You're not selling a religion, you're selling meaning. And the 17th century market for meaning is absolutely catastrophically enormous. The year is 1665. You are 39. You have been wandering for 17 years, and you are about to meet the most important person of your life. His name is Nathan of Gaza, and he is everything you are not. You are charismatic but volatile. You spiral. You disappear into depression for months, then emerge burning white hot. You are unpredictable in the way that is either messianic or terrifying, depending on the day. Nathan is none of that. Nathan is calm, precise, and frighteningly intelligent. He is a young scholar in Gaza who has been having his own mystical visions, and in those visions, he sees you. He doesn't just believe in you, he builds you a complete theological framework. He writes letters, careful, detailed, beautifully argued letters, to Jewish communities across the known world, explaining exactly why you are the one, citing scripture, citing Kabbalistic prophecy, citing the cosmic timing of the approaching year 1666. He does your PR. He is your operations executive, your communications director, and your chief theologian, all wrapped in one young scholar's body. Think about this in modern terms. You're the founder, brilliant, volatile, genuinely visionary, at least during the highs, but impossible to manage and prone to making bizarre, brand-damaging decisions that need constant explanation. Nathan is the COO who steps in and makes you legible to investors, and you make a lot of bizarre decisions. You declare new holy days without consulting anyone. You eat shellfish in public, a violation of Jewish dietary law, and laugh about it. You sing Spanish love songs during sacred prayer services. You conduct yourself in ways that should, by any logical measure, destroy your credibility entirely. But Nathan has an explanation ready for every single one. The Messiah operates beyond the boundaries of ordinary law. He absorbs the world's sin into himself so that we don't have to. This is precisely what the ancient Kabbalistic texts predicted for the Anointed One. Every cult in history has a Nathan, the indispensable person who makes the madness legible, who takes the erratic founder's energy and converts it into something scalable. Without Nathan, you're just that weird guy from Smyrna. With Nathan, you become history. What happens next is, by any historical measure, genuinely unprecedented. Nathan's letters spread. By ship, by horse, by word of mouth across trade routes. From Gaza to Cairo to Istanbul to Amsterdam to Hamburg to the Jewish communities of Poland, Morocco, and Yemen. And everywhere those letters land, the same explosion detonates. People lose their minds. Grown adults, educated, sophisticated adults, sell their houses. Merchants close their shops and donate the proceeds to the movement. Rabbis abandon their pulpits to prepare for migration to the Holy Land. In Amsterdam, one of the most educated, commercially sophisticated Jewish communities in the entire world, prominent businessmen publicly declare you to be the true Messiah and begin extended fasts in preparation for the coming redemption. The year 1666 is approaching, and in Kabbalistic numerology, 1666 is the year of divine reckoning, the year the exile ends. The fever is everywhere, and your name is at the center of it, and you watch this from inside the hurricane. Your periods of illumination are more intense than ever. You are surrounded by devoted followers at all hours. You have an entourage. People weep when you enter a room. Old women kiss your hands. You hold massive public celebrations that blur the line between prayer service and carnival, and every person there leaves feeling like they just touched something real. But here's what the history books don't slow down for. In the dark hours, between the illuminations, in the 3 o'clock silences, you feel the full, crushing weight of what has been built in your name. Millions of people have restructured their entire lives around a promise that lives inside your skull. You have watched old men weep with relief that the waiting, the endless, generational waiting, is finally over. You have looked into the face of someone who has sold their house on the promise of your messiahhood and felt the specific cold dread of knowing exactly what that means if you are wrong. You pray in those moments, genuinely pray, to whatever is actually out there. You pray that you are right. Here is how you maintain the illusion over years. Rule 1. Never give a specific date. Always soon. Always when the divine hour arrives. The vagueness is not weakness. It's structural armor. A specific date can be disproved on the calendar. The appointed time cannot. Rule 2. Reframe every failure as confirmation. When a prediction doesn't materialize on schedule, that is also a test. God is testing the depth of your faith. The Messiah's path requires descending through suffering before ascending to glory. In modern hustle culture terms, this is called a growth mindset. In the 17th century, it is called theology. Rule 3. Keep moving. A prophet who has spent his life in one city is a local curiosity. A prophet who has touched every major community across 3 continents is a legend, because every community's witnesses confirm him to the next. But rule 4, and this is the one that will eventually cost everything, is the most insidious. Never fully stop believing, because the moment you allow the doubt to fully surface, the moment you let yourself truly acknowledge that you might be a man rather than a messiah, the entire architecture, the theology, the letters, the sold houses, the packed luggage, the weeping old men, collapses. And you cannot let it collapse. Too many people are living inside it. So you stay in character, completely. You have no choice anymore. What began as conviction, or at least the memory of conviction during the bright hours, has hardened into performance, and the performance has become the prison. You are, at this point, the most expensive actor in history. The role costs everyone around you everything. In early 1666, you announce your next move. You are sailing to Constantinople to depose the Ottoman Sultan and claim the throne as the rightful ruler of the world and herald of the new age. Your followers cheer. Nathan writes another letter. The faithful in Poland and Amsterdam and Morocco hold their breath. The Ottomans quietly prepare to arrest you before your ship finishes docking. And here is the extraordinary part. Even arrest does not break the fever. You are imprisoned in a fortress called Abydos on the Dardanelles Strait, but it is not really a prison. The Ottoman authorities are caught in a trap of their own, execute you, and they create a martyr whose legend lasts centuries. Let you wander free and the movement grows. So they compromise. They hold you in a comfortable tower, allow your followers to visit, and wait. Your followers immediately rename it the Tower of Strength. Thousands of pilgrims travel across the Mediterranean to see you. You hold court from inside your captivity. You make declarations. You receive letters from the scattered faithful. The movement does not quiet. It intensifies. The imprisoned Messiah was always part of the story, wasn't it? Suffering before glory. Of course, it all fits. Back in the Jewish world, the fever is at its absolute maximum. In Avignon, Jews process through the streets singing your name. In Hamburg, merchants write clauses into commercial contracts, obligations void if the Messiah arrives. In Poland, entire communities are mid-process of selling their possessions in preparation for the Great Migration home to the Holy Land. You are, at this moment, the most famous Jewish person alive. Possibly the most famous Jewish person in 1,000 years. The power is real. The love is real. The devotion flooding toward you from across the known world is real. You have done something no one in history has quite managed. You have made millions of rational, educated people believe simultaneously that the world is about to end and they are ready. In early 1666, you announce your next move. You are sailing to Constantinople to depose the Ottoman Sultan and claim the throne as the rightful ruler of the world and herald of the new age. Your followers cheer. Nathan writes another letter. The faithful in Poland and Amsterdam and Morocco hold their breath. The Ottomans quietly prepare to arrest you before your ship finishes docking. And here is the extraordinary part. Even arrest does not break the fever. You are imprisoned in a fortress called Abydos on the Dardanelles Strait, but it is not really a prison. The Ottoman authorities are caught in a trap of their own, execute you, and they create a martyr whose legend lasts centuries. Let you wander free and the movement grows. So they compromise. They hold you in a comfortable tower, allow your followers to visit, and wait. Your followers immediately rename it the Tower of Strength. Thousands of pilgrims travel across the Mediterranean to see you. You hold court from inside your captivity. You make declarations. You receive letters from the scattered faithful. The movement does not quiet. It intensifies. The imprisoned Messiah was always part of the story, wasn't it? Suffering before glory. Of course, it all fits. Back in the Jewish world, the fever is at its absolute maximum. In Avignon, Jews process through the streets singing your name. In Hamburg, merchants write clauses into commercial contracts, obligations void if the Messiah arrives. In Poland, entire communities are mid-process of selling their possessions in preparation for the Great Migration home to the Holy Land. You are, at this moment, the most famous Jewish person alive. Possibly the most famous Jewish person in 1,000 years. The power is real. The love is real. The devotion flooding toward you from across the known world is real. You have done something no one in history has quite managed. You have made millions of rational, educated people believe simultaneously that the world is about to end and they are ready. He spends the rest of his life producing increasingly elaborate theological architecture to explain a single moment that cannot be explained. He dies still believing, still writing, still insisting. Most people, though, just learn to not say your name. You spend your final years in Dulcigno, a small Albanian coastal town, essentially internal exile. The Ottomans still pay your salary. You still have a handful of visitors who arrive like people visiting a monument that has been defaced, coming to see what used to be there. You oscillate between identities. You conduct Jewish prayer services in secret. You study Muslim theology publicly. You drift between your two selves with no anchor left in either. You write letters that nobody answers. You move through days that have no particular shape or purpose. The illuminations still come, occasionally. Those periods where the universe feels close and bright and full of hidden meaning, but they come less frequently, and they end more abruptly, and you no longer know what to do with them when they arrive. You die on the 17th of September, 1676, alone. It is Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement. The timing is either meaningful or entirely coincidental. That is the question your entire life reduces to. It depends on whether you believe. Here is what history does with you. It calls you a fraud, a charlatan, a mentally ill man who exploited the desperation of a suffering people for status, for followers, for the experience of being adored. And there is truth in that framing. You cannot argue with it from wherever you are. But here is what history doesn't slow down for. The Jewish communities of the 17th century were not stupid. These were scholars, philosophers, merchants, the most literate civilian population in Europe. They had survived the Spanish Inquisition and the Cossack massacres and 1,000 years of quiet, grinding exile. They were not naive people. They were desperate people, and desperation and naivety are not the same thing. They believed because 15 centuries of waiting had made hope feel more rational than despair, because their entire tradition was built on the promise that the waiting would eventually end. Because you arrived in a world that had been holding its breath for 1,000 years, and you told them they could finally exhale. You gave them that, briefly. You gave them the feeling that the suffering had been pointing somewhere. The deeper tragedy is not that you were false. The deeper tragedy is that you were partially real, and that might be the worst thing. A pure con man could be dismissed, burned away cleanly. But you were a man with a genuinely broken, genuinely brilliant mind, a world-class strategist in his corner, and a civilization so hungry for meaning that it ran toward you before you could finish the sentence. You were made as much as you made yourself. History will remember you as a cautionary tale, a warning, a case study in the psychology of messianic movements, taught in university courses and footnoted in religious histories. But the old woman in Poland who sold her house and waited? The merchant in Amsterdam who wrote the clause into his contracts? The young scholar who spent his whole life defending you, writing letters nobody answered, dying still believing in something that had already dissolved? History forgot them entirely. And somewhere right now, in some city, in some corner of the internet, in some room with good lighting and a microphone, someone is standing in front of a crowd, telling them exactly what they need to hear, and the crowd is leaning in, and the crowd is opening their wallets, and the crowd is selling their houses, and the crowd believes, because the crowd always believes, because the alternative is to sit alone with the possibility that the suffering doesn't point anywhere at all. And you know something? You can't even blame them. Yeah,